Welcome back. I'm on the road today down to Renton, Washington to meet with Michael. Michael's an aerospace engineer who has come up with a very ingenuitive way of showing the random dispersion problems associated with doing load development and load analysis. And I wanted to share that with you today. So let's get down there and do an interview with Michael. All right, we're with Michael now, and Michael is an aerospace engineer, as I've told you before. And he's been doing some work with precision and accuracy. Ignore the cat in the background. Kitty is unhappy. We're just going to keep going anyway. Michael, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
You've been a patron of the channel for quite some time. And I met you through that function. And we actually had a Zoom conference back about, probably 3 months ago. And what I took from that was absolute awe of your ability to visually show what I've been trying to explain to people for some time, and that is the randomness that tends to reduce the signal to noise ratio when we're doing load development or tuner adjustments or anything that affects our precision and accuracy. I don't know if the viewers understand this, but engineers solve problems for a living. Is that right?
Absolutely.
And the problems you work with are things like flight dynamics and vibration, things like that?
Structural loads and dynamics, yeah.
Okay. And this is one of the things that I see in the shooting sports is we have experts that don't have the physics background to understand what they're doing, and they don't have the scientific background. And that's where bringing in someone like yourself is so important, so we can understand the whole picture, so to speak. I want you to tell your story of how this came together. So can you kind of give me an overview of what the problem was that you were trying to solve when you started?
Sure. Yeah, so as a shooter, I'm a hunter first and a shooter second. I don't compete, but I am very interested in developing a consistent and reliable rifle system, ammunition and rifle and optic and everything, the information that goes along with it, so that when I'm hunting, I can take an ethical shot. And, I grew up shooting and reloading with my dad, and we always did the old school, testing 3-5 shots and picking the best group and then going back and doing that again. And that's what I've done this whole time up until this book came out. Mr. Brian Litt's Volume 3, Modern Advancements. Part 1, he talks through precision testing and the difficulty that comes from trying to characterize a system with a lot of variables and a lot of dispersions, right? And so his conclusions are pretty upsetting. And honestly, like I've seen, this has set the whole industry on fire, right? All the biggest names in the industry are responding to the content of this book. And rightly so, because he is saying that, when you have this complex system and you make a change and then only take 3 or 5 samples, you really aren't getting a reliable picture of what's going on. You aren't correctly characterizing that new population of data. And so I just bought a new barrel, and I'm getting ready to do my new hunting rifle right as this thing comes out. And so I was like, I should really try to internalize his messages here, right? And at first I was a little defeatist. I was like, I'm just gonna put some components together and shoot 10 shots, and if I don't like it, I'll change components.
Okay.
But I didn't get answers I liked, even when trying 3 different powders, 2 different primers, 3 different bullets, all these different combinations. I wasn't getting answers I liked. And so, I wanted to tune. I had to tune, right? Because that's what I've always done. And so I wanted to try and figure out, like, do I need to take 50 shots of every single combo in order to do any tuning? Because that seems basically impossible, unfeasible. Or is there a different way that I can do it? Where I can get, more data, so to speak, out of the same set of testing. And I have a 22 Tikka 22 T1X, and it's pretty new to me, very accurate gun, super fun to shoot. And so I thought, you know what, I'm gonna go to the range and I'm gonna shoot a bunch of shots of 22. And so I took my favorite box of 500 rounds of 22, and I went to the range on 4 different days. I shot 50 rounds, 10 5-shot groups. And these are the targets from all this testing. And so I measured the group size, and I ended up with 38 groups because I took 10 to get all sighted in and make sure I was good. So I have 38 groups, 190 shots. And the first thing I did is I got home, I measured my groups like I always do, and I plotted them up. And sure enough, you can see this just wild variation in group size, even though the ammo's not changing, the rifle's not changing. It's 50 yards from a bench, from a rest, mild conditions, as mild as it gets. And yet I can see groups as low as 0.2 inches and groups as high as 0.85 inches, all the same. So that right there corresponds with what Brian presents in part 1, right? That all things held constant, you will still get lots of variation sample to sample. And I plotted the distribution of these groups because that's another thing he talks about is that group size is normally distributed. And I did not see a normal distribution. I should say up front, I am not a statistician. I have no formal education in statistics. So when I start reading about what kind of population is this or what kind of distribution is that, it's a log distribution or Rayleigh or normal, and they have all these different tests and all these particular things. That's beyond me. There's many other people who are better equipped to talk about that than me. But I did observe this distribution being very non-normal. So I thought that was interesting. The next thing I did is, looking at all these targets, just pulling group size from these it started to feel like, man, I'm leaving a lot of information on the paper, right? There's every single shot here is a signal, but I'm only pulling, 2 out of 5 essentially shots when I measure group ES. So I thought, you know what? Why don't I sit down and measure every single shot to get more information, right? I'm getting more value out of my testing. And so I did that. And the way I did it, just brief detail, is each different day that I went to the range, the zero shifts with temperature and how you happen to set up on the rest. So I recentered, I calculated a relative center for each day. So each group of 50 shots gets its own center.
So just to clarify,
yeah.
So what you're doing is you're taking the center from a centroid from all the groups for the day, or from each individual group?
All the groups of the day.
All the groups of the day.
Yeah.
Okay. And this is kind of where I fell into the story with you, because you brought me this information and it was mind blowing. It absolutely was mind blowing. I didn't even think about how to do something like that prior to that, because you're now talking about checking each shot relative to the center of the group. It's distance from center, correct? You're not doing direction, just distance?
Just distance, yeah. I mean, it's like shooting 50 shots on one bullseye, right? One point of aim. But obviously, when you do that, you end up with one big hole. You don't actually know where each shot is going. So this is a way of like getting that same picture and all the intermediate data points, right?
Okay.
Because you could shoot 50 shots and measure ES, but now you're only getting one piece of data for 50 shots instead of 50 pieces of data, right?
Yeah.
Even though it may be a more representative of group size, I wanted to see what happened if I pulled every single shot and plotted it. And unfortunately, I couldn't find any software to do this. I guess, there are some apps that will show you the coordinate of each shot, but they don't export it, right? Mm-hmm. And I wanted to be able to plot the data and manipulate it, so I just measured. It doesn't take that long, but okay, so I went and did that, and I plotted every shot, 190 shots, which you can see here. And I found this very interesting, and it looks like a uniform cluster about the center, right? Mm-hmm. Which you don't necessarily get when you look at the individual groups. Some groups are big with a flyer, right? Yeah. Some groups are small, nice bug holes. Mm-hmm. But really, there's this bigger cluster around center that you can only observe when you take a bunch of shots and plot them all up. And so I found that interesting. And I plotted up the each radius from the test. Now, there's still a lot of variability in individual shot radii, right? Just like with group size. But I have 190 data points now instead of 38. And it just, more data is usually better. So the next thing I did, I was kind of curious now, because the question I'm getting back to is like, can I tune with a reasonable number of shots?
Yeah.
So what I did was I calculated the running average from 0 to 190
Okay.
of average radius.
So
now I'm working in radius.
Your effective mean radius from center, right?
Yes, but if I stopped after 20 shots, what would be the answer I get? If I stop after 40, what's the answer I get? And distribution of shots, again, a different topic. But the running average, so you can see here that, the average deviates from the correct answer. And I'm taking the correct answer as, the average after 190. That's the best answer I have, right? And so, if you stop after 20 or after 40 shots, you can be more than 10% from the correct answer. And again, this would seem to agree with what Brian presented in his book, is that, there's a lot of variability.
So what is the risk of being off by 10%? Say you have two loads and you're trying to figure out which one you're going to use for your match load. What's the risk here for the shooter that's trying to figure out which one to use?
Yeah, I think the risk is that you think you have a certain level of precision, but you don't. Or you do some powder sweep or something, and you think you've identified a better charge, but you really haven't.
Okay.
Because the difference between groups might be small. And actually, this is something I want to touch on later, but if you have a large difference between two different groups, 50 or 100%, small samples will work, right? Confidently, and I'll show that in a little bit. Because, even after 10 shots, you might say I can characterize to within 30%. And if you have a 100% difference in group size after 5 shots or 10 shots, that is significant, right? You're getting a strong signal. So I think the significance of all of this is that, you have to take small samples with a big grain of salt and don't necessarily hang your hat on the number that it's telling you, one group of 3 shots or 5 shots. It's not going to be, probably not going to hold if you keep testing that. But the variations group to group, right? If you shoot 10 shots of one, 10 shots of another, they're 100% different. And you can say, I think, on average, 10 shots should get me within 30% of the correct answer. Well, those two populations don't overlap. So now you actually have like a meaningful result, even with small samples. But I'll show how I get to that in a second. So as I looked at this, I realized that, if I had counted rather than going from here and measuring down and entering my radii sequentially, if I had started here and gone back, had a different sequence of shots, this plot would look different. Because now I'm getting, I could get my 10 worst shots up front and I would think, oh, now 10 shots is meaningless. Or I could get my 10 best shots that are all right on average up front, and I would say, oh, 10 shots is great. So what I did was, using some coding tools, I took the sequence of 190 shots and I randomized them and then redid that running average. And using the computer, I did that 1,000 times. And when you do that, you can come up with this plot.
Which is what I call the funnel chart.
Yeah, exactly. And now the y-axis here is normalized to error. So I'm just dividing by the radius that I get at the end of 190. So 0.5 here means 50% error. Your answer at that point would be 50% off of the true answer after 190. And what you can see is that indeed there are some sequences of the same 190 shots that could give you an answer, 100% wrong. You could be high by 100% or low by 100%, just depending on, same data. But if this group happened first versus this group happening first, I would get a different result. And maybe my conclusion about number of required shots would be different.
Yeah. And looking at that chart, it's very dense down the center line.
Yes.
So there's a lot of sequences, and I think this is important to explain. There's a lot of sequences that do give you a relatively true answer all the way through.
Yep.
But there's, that's only a percentage of them that give you the true answer most of the way through. The rest of them are off by quite a bit, at various amounts off. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And so the next thing I did is I took statistics on these trials. So we're getting a little fancy here, but basically what this chart shows is the mean of the trials running average and the standard deviation of that running average.
Okay.
So what this says is that over 1,000 trials, when you take 20 shots, your standard deviation is 11%. And your average is right on. You'll notice that in general, the average will condense very quickly. So on average, the average is meaningful. But the standard deviation is large. So what that means is that, in the case of 5 shots, there's a 23% standard deviation in error. So if you did a 5-shot group 20 times, you should expect that over those 20 trials, your answer will probably be within, 46% of the correct answer, right? In 19 out of 20 trials. This is just using, standard deviations and how much population that encompasses in general.
Yeah, let me interrupt here just for the viewer's sake. As we both know, standard deviation is used to describe a normal distribution. So 95% of your data is going to be within plus or minus 2 standard deviations of your average, your mean. So when we have an 11% standard deviation, what we're saying is there is a very large percentage that's in the middle there, but that can extend out as much as 22% either side. And to get to 99.5%, we're talking 3 standard deviations. So we're looking at a 66% window here that we're falling into, to a 66% window error on our average.
Yep.
So
if you repeated that 5-shot test, you would get a different answer each time.
Yeah.
Probably. That's what it's telling you, right? And the power of more samples is that you bring that standard deviation down. Like the amount of scatter you should expect from doing a test will come down and down and down, right? And so at 20 shots, that standard deviation goes to 11%. It's more than halved. And now that means that after 20 trials, you could expect to be within, 20%, let's say 22% of the correct answer, right? Okay. And so this is, again, it underscores what Brian is saying, but it also tells you that, what I said earlier, if you have 100% difference in groups, 5 shots is actually pretty reasonable to characterize that, right? Mm-hmm. Because those means are so far apart that you can afford a lot of error on your mean, and you still have a meaningful result. And as the differences get smaller and smaller, you need to do more and more samples to tell them apart.
Some advice for the viewers here. I've said in my videos that when I'm doing load development, I'm not looking for the best load. I'm looking for the ones that I need to exclude because they do not perform to the level required. Is that still valid after looking at this data?
Yeah, because I think what you're saying there really is that you can tell from a small number of samples that a certain load is big, right? In this case, we would be talking about shot radius, right? But if I have 3 shots each an inch away from the center of the target, my average radius is an inch, and that's large. And it can get smaller. It's not like group size. The radius, if you then put 10 shots right in the middle, the average would come down. But that is a large signal. That would be very unlikely to happen, right? Your mean is now so big that then if you take 3 shots and they're each a quarter inch away, you can tell right away, like, hey, that is a significant result. This group is 4x larger average radius than the other. I don't really need to do a lot of testing to convince myself that that's a bad load. And so now in my load development now, what I do is I start with small samples, broad sweep, big changes, grain and powder or more, depending on what I'm loading for. And I'm looking for large differences and trends. Mm-hmm. And, I subscribe to the theory of rifle accuracy that has to do with barrel harmonics. And the fact that, barrel has very consistent characteristic vibrational modes. That's proven for 300 years. A cantilever beam bending, if you want to look it up. And each shot is pretty similar excitation, right? You're basically hitting that barrel with a hammer and it's ringing out. And it does that very consistently. And so this idea that there are motions at the end of the barrel that relate to these harmonic modes and that affects the dispersion on target is totally reasonable to me. So that's the school of thought I agree to. We're talking 1 minute of angle is 1/60th of a degree, which is 1/360th of a circle, right? Mm-hmm. You'd have trouble drawing me 1 degree slice on this piece of paper, right? And we're talking about a 60th of that, which is 0.16 degrees, 0.016 degrees, excuse me. And if you look at a 24-inch barrel and rotate it 0.016 degrees, that's 7 thousandths of deflection at the end of the barrel. Mm-hmm. My hunting barrel is 650 thousandths thick at the end. So it's moving 1% of its thickness. You probably couldn't even see it.
You can't see it. Nope.
And that's a 1 MOA group. That's a bad group for a lot of people, right? And when people talk about a half-minute group out of their 24-inch barrel, that's 3 thousandths. So it doesn't take much. And, I've read Harold Vaughn's book, and he builds a finite element model and fires a shot in the computer and records the deflection. Then he goes and puts sensors on a test barrel and does the same thing and shows that, yes, this happens. So I believe in that theory. And I believe that if you adjust the bullet timing, you can get different group sizes. And so when I see a target with this happening in group size as I change my powder or whatever variable it is used to control bullet time, I believe that those trends exist. And so, when you're doing your small sample testing up front, you're looking to characterize your barrel harmonic motion, right? If you think about it that way, and you do, let's say, a 5x5 sweep on powder, 5 shots, 5 charges, and your goal is to test the barrel harmonics, you're actually using 25 samples to do that, right?
Yeah.
And the trend is being pretty thoroughly, well explored with 25 samples. It's not 5 samples, right? You're looking at the bigger cluster of data. And again, if you took any one of those groups and expected that to hold up to 50 samples of testing, probably won't. But the trend is there. And that's the meaningful use of small samples, is to characterize these broader trends. Then you pick your charge of interest, that's got good group or low vertical or low horizontal or, mm-hmm. Whatever it is you want. And as you drill down on that, now let's say you do half grain or 0.3 of a grain variations, you should crank up the samples, because now you're looking at smaller differences, and in order to characterize them well, you need to do more samples.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you're kind of tickling the edges of my theory of inherent precision right there. And the viewers on YouTube haven't heard about this. I've told it to the patrons, but I haven't told it to the YouTube crowd. So inherent precision, just for the viewers' sake, is, and we've discussed this before, is the idea that a rifle can be designed in a way that its worst and its best, the difference between the two, start to narrow. And the narrower that spread is, the easier it is to have a rifle that is acceptable, close enough to in tune to serve its intended purpose. So when you talk about sweeping over a large area like that and looking at what the rifle does over a large charge range that's kind of distributed widely, what you're looking for realistically is how bad does the rifle get and how good does the rifle get over a relatively broad window. And so you're right there talking about characterizing the inherent precision of the rifle itself. And that, yes, small samples absolutely works for that, mm-hmm. for determining that.
Yeah, and you would expect a very different result if you shot, a 125 straight contour, 15-pound gun versus a featherweight, hunting rifle pushing a big caliber. And by the way, I also Brian talks about his theory of precision, his Top Gun theory here, which is a really simple conservation of momentum calculation, right? And what it's saying is, if you have a heavier bullet going faster out of a lighter gun, the gun is going to move more by the time the bullet leaves the barrel. And that's also totally realistic first principle stuff. So yeah, I think if you can make your system stiffer and perturb it less, aka smaller caliber or cartridge, you should expect to see less variation, right?
Yes.
And that's why some people might test with a hunting rifle and get different answers than some, and establish a different conclusion about harmonic trends and whether or not they exist than if they test with a super rigid bench rest gun or something like that. I mean, the other part of that is just noise in the system, right? Like if you're shooting a bench rest gun, chances are it's a custom barrel, more tight tolerances, which can lead to more uniform behaviors. Chances are you're also an experienced shooter if you've gone to the trouble of, buying and building a bench rest gun like that, right? So your ability to get good signal out of your system is better than the guy who buys a, X-bolt off the shelf and a box of ammo, all of which have lots of error built into them, and maybe he's not a consistent shooter. I mean, I see myself make mistakes all the time. And then you go try and do testing, and you got to try and suss out the signal from the ammo versus the signal from everything else, right? Which can be a lot of noise. And so recognizing your signal to noise ratio, if you will, and whether or not the testing you're doing is of quality or not, right? That's also an art, and it takes a lot of practice to do good testing. And so for your example, building a rifle where your worst day is still a very good day, that makes a ton of sense. Then you don't even really have to worry so much about tuning, right? Pick your velocity goal that you want for whatever your requirements are, and ramp the powder up until you get there, pick the right bullet. Maybe you do a little bit of tweaking once you see it, but in general, you're gonna have a good day, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
And that's the whole point. When you travel with a rifle to go to a competition, you don't know what the weather's going to be for sure. You have a pretty good guess if you use your pocket computer to do that, but you don't know for certain what you're going to run into when you get there. So you have to have a system that is tolerant to changes in the atmosphere, changes in your shooting style, and changes to your equipment that are unanticipated. For instance, if you're shooting off of a front rest or a bag in F-class and you get blasted with the gritty sand at Rattlesnake or Phoenix, it's going to change the drag on the forend of the rifle, and that's going to change how the rifle shoots a little bit. So you need to have a rifle system that is tolerant to those things and still performs up to an acceptable level, even when those things change, without having to worry about whether you're in or out of tune. Because if you have a system that goes out of tune every time a butterfly flaps its wings, you're in trouble. You're not going to perform well over time. And that's really the goal of the entire channel, is to teach people how to get to that situation where they go to the range and they're confident in their equipment. They know it's going to shoot. All they have to do is lay down and do their part of the equation, and they're going to put up good scores and perhaps win matches. So you're right there on the same plane with what I've been working with for quite some time, trying to help people understand the underlying concepts and why exotic may give really small groups in a test scenario, but when you take it into the wild, it may not work quite so well for you.
Yep. And again, I see all sorts of videos online or whatever, blog posts and stuff, where people report that their gun went out of tune as, humidity went up 3% or something, right?
Yeah.
And first of all, I don't know the underlying mechanics that would cause that from like first principles again, right?
Yeah.
That doesn't, maybe there's some things like temperature which could have a stronger effect. But second of all, if you're shooting a string of 20 shots for record and you see 3 shots starting to do something different, and you say, my gun is off, my gun is out of tune, you're basing that off of a small sample, right?
Right.
And it might be deviating from what you're used to, but, you got to be careful where you point the finger when you only see a little bit of data, right?
Yeah.
And again, large signals, maybe that's the case, but going from a 10 to an 8 or 10 to a 9 is really kind of a small difference. And so reacting to that, you need to base it in, be sure before you go make a change, because then it might do something completely different.
And that's one of the things that I tell people. If the rifle starts hitting somewhere else, look at your conditions first. Look at your environment. Did something change? Did a thermal release from the floor of the range? Did the wind change angle slightly and now the air is tumbling over the berm toward you? Because the air does bounce and tumble across the range in a lot of cases, and people don't recognize it. They see the wind as a horizontal function, and it also has vertical components that they don't realize.
Yeah.
So it's real easy for people to get confused as to what the cause of a seeming out of tune situation is, when in fact they fired one shot into one part of the tumble, and as that moves downwind because of velocity change, now they go from a downdraft to an updraft, and they say I have a huge amount of vertical. They actually don't have anything wrong with the rifle.
Yeah,
it's
exactly.
the wind, the vertical winds are blowing them around, and they don't realize it.
Yeah. I mean, I shoot guns that recoil pretty heavily because I'm lightweight hunting rifles. And man, the biggest signal is me. Whether or not I deal with the recoil properly. If my coat gets bunched like this, and when I take a shot, the rifle squeezes off a fold of cloth, you can feel that, the gun jumps one way and you're like, oh, my shot went left, or if your rest changes underneath you, or you take 3 shots and each shot the rest is doing this, and then the 4th shot you slip off of a seam or something, right? And now you throw one. Those things express on target, right? Again, we're talking about very small movements. So yeah, turning immediately to the gun is hard to justify, right? And again, if all the more, I do believe that for a system that you want to hang your hat on, you need to do a lot of testing. And once you do that, the beauty is you know what to care about and not care about. Because you're like, no, I've actually seen over 37 shots of radius testing. I've seen a radius of 1 inch, right? Even in ideal conditions. It's part of the population. So if I see an inch low hit or a minute low hit at whatever range, it's not necessarily a tune problem. That can be a real signal, right? Or just a real expression of the rifle.
Yeah, and it can be any number of things. It could be a primer that didn't quite pop the same as the rest.
Exactly.
It could be powder charge not quite right. The powder had something on it. There's all kinds of possibilities there that can cause that to happen. And we've seen most of them over time. I mean, 10 years of doing F-class, I've seen a lot of stuff happen, mostly to me because of my own fault. So yeah, there's a lot of opportunity to point the fingers back at yourself when you see something like that happen. Scratch your head a little bit and think about what might have caused it. The problem is when you have one and it's already downrange, you don't have a chance to do an autopsy on it to figure out what happened.
Yeah.
But if all of a sudden you see your ammunition change, you can then take that extra round home and do an autopsy and say, okay, what did I do here? What problem did I cause? Is the primer seated all the way? Did I get the right charge in it? Or did I change charges in the middle of my load session? Or did I take two different ammunition specifications with me? Because people do that. I have, and I know virtually everybody I've ever run into has done it at one time or another.
Yeah, let's say you're loading, and I use a Charge Master Supreme or whatever, and sometimes as the last shot is trickling out, I seat the next shot, and that bump on my bench can kick some granules out. And then if I change the sequence, I wait and make sure I avoid, maybe my charges that come out of the second half of my reloading session are actually more consistent or a little lower, right? So yeah, there can be all sorts of procedural differences, but it's just, I think that's why thoroughly testing, it's probably more valuable to thoroughly test over time and really characterize well once you zero in on something that seems to perform well, than it is to constantly be changing things, chasing this like perfect tune in your rifle, reacting to little samples every time, and going up and down in powder and in and out in seating depth and neck tension and all these other things, right? Because you might just be chasing noise, literally.
So for a precision shooter, for someone that's shooting F-class, PRS, even bench rest, I hate to bring bench rest in because they load at the range and they literally change from relay to relay what their load is. They're using their experience to make modifications to their load to hopefully get the best possible outcome. But we all understand the temporal problem here in that you only get one chance to shoot this and you only get one combination that you get to send down range when you shoot a group. It's not like you can shoot all of them simultaneously with the same bullets and compare them, because that's just not possible. If we had a time machine, we could do it, but otherwise we don't have that chance. For a competitor, like an F-class competitor or a PRS competitor, that needs to go with loaded ammunition to a match to shoot, they do initial load development. They have a new barrel. Hopefully they get it seasoned before they do load development so that the barrel speeds up and quits fooling around, because they do that.
Yeah.
And then they're going to develop their first load. And they're going to say, this is my load, and they're going to go to their first match. What advice would you give from that point, before they even fire their first shot for score, as for an overall overarching strategy for them to take?
I think if you can record the impacts downrange, like maybe you're shooting an electronic target or something, or you go and take the paper afterwards. If you can come up, you can use, let's say you shoot 5 shots at 5 different ranges. That's 25 samples of the exact same load, right? And so now take that data, and I would go and plot all my shots up, even as a function of range. And yeah, conditions will play a role. But again, like let's say you're shooting at 500, there's some wind, but for the time that you're shooting that group, that wind is relatively consistent. It might blow your group off center, but if you do what I do, which is take the relative center, and I'm just looking now at the group and taking radius from the virtual center of that group, you can get a bunch of data to characterize your load, right? And at different ranges, and you see if your MOA spread holds, or if it's probably going to be a little bit different if you're shooting 5 different 5-shot groups. But you can use that to characterize your rifle, and just start putting it in the bank. Like on my hunting rifle, I have 52 shots that I've recorded over probably 10 different shooting sessions, or maybe 8 different shooting sessions. Just yesterday, I went and shot out to 700 yards, and I shot all the intermediate ranges, and for a while I was just shooting steel to see if I was, getting impacts. But at a certain point, I went and shot a group of 5 at each range, and I took that data and logged it all. So I put that in the bank of my ongoing characterization of the same exact load. Okay. And so what I'm doing is I'm moving down this curve, right? I can now expect that I'm getting closer and closer and closer to the true performance of my load. The reason that's helpful, in my opinion, is that if the behavior starts to change, or if the signal starts to change, now you have an actual firm numerical basis in order to assess that, right? So if your barrel starts to change, right, shoots out, velocity starts to migrate, group size starts to change because the bullet exit timing is changing, you can evaluate that. And that's, again, a topic probably for a different video. How do you compare 2 different populations of data, and how do you analyze if they're similar or different to a certain confidence level? But you can do that once you have the data. So yeah, my advice is it's take every opportunity you can to log data and characterize your system. And as you start to chase smaller and smaller variations, you need more and more data to do that confidently. And if you're seeing a small variation but you don't have a lot of data, maybe don't react to it right away unless you have a very strong explanation for what happened, right?
Yeah.
Like you find an equipment problem later, a loose screw or something. It's like, okay, maybe that's what caused it.
Yeah.
But even then, you could go back and compare to your baseline, right? But it's about establishing a statistically meaningful baseline so that later, as things change, which they probably will, you have some ground to stand on. You know what to compare against, right? But if you're just constantly tweaking knobs, you're putting all this variation and signal into the system, and then the system changing gets lost, right? You can't really see that when all you have is different loads and different data, right? So nowadays, yeah, I put a lot more emphasis on good quality components and a more thoroughly tested, even if maybe less stellar for one particular day, I shot a better group, that's okay. I'm going to stick with what I have well characterized, because at the end of the day, that's probably, a better data point than this one stellar group that I managed to shoot. So
yeah, and that's something that I've had people approach me and say, you need to do a video on the effect of chasing the point of impact across the target in F class. It's exactly the same thing. If you have a hit that is high, you're firing and you're hitting basically on waterline, and then you have one that hits at the top of the X-ring, what do you do about that? Uh-oh, one of the cameras just died. So what do you do about that if you have one hit high? So the point is, you make the group bigger by chasing it than you do by simply remaining constant and watching to see what it does. Now, if it verifies itself and hits high again, and then it does it again, okay, you've had a change in your zero as a result of conditions. It could be mechanical, but it's probably conditions. And you now need to adjust a little bit. But sometimes cranking on the scope knobs every time you see something move is counterproductive. And that's really what you're saying too. If you start cranking on your seating depth, your tuner, your power charge every time you are dissatisfied with the outcome of a relay, you never have a baseline. Mm-hmm. And for me in F class, I've shot this same charge for years. I mean, it's been 10 years. I've shot 51.1 grains of H4350 to make just over 2,800 feet a second out of a 30-inch barrel, and it works for me in every single barrel, and the seating depth is the same on every single barrel that's reamed with this one reamer. I don't have to change, and it produces good results every time I use it. Now, there are a few barrels that when they come in, brand new barrels, you season them and they're slower than the others. I have to increase the charge to get up to the velocity, and then they shoot with the rest of the population.
Because your barrel time is the same.
Because the barrel time ends up the same. So I think the key in all of this is don't chase it. You know, if you start chasing it around in circles, you're going to start chasing your own tail.
Yeah.
And when you do that, you end up with a situation where you never can keep up with what you've changed, nor do you have any ingrained knowledge of what the rifle does, because you're so busy chasing it back and forth. And that's really, I think that's the message that you're giving us, and that's the message that I'm trying to teach people too, is be consistent in one place. Now, if it's shooting 8-ring to 8-ring vertical,
exactly, that's what I was going to say.
Then you have a huge signal that says something is wrong.
Yeah.
Go fix that.
That was a more than 3 sigma radius that I just got, right?
Exactly.
Like I literally think of everything. I'm messed up now, right? I see a group like this and I'm like, oh, that's a very consistent radius. That's a nice, good performance, right? Even though the group is big. But to me, the azimuth is random. Mm-hmm. And so I'm just looking at distance. If so, I know for this gun, the mean radius is 0.2 inches, the standard deviation is 0.1 inches.
Okay.
So I ought to expect, at a 3 sigma level, a 1/2 inch radius, which equals a 1 inch group. Okay. So if I start shooting shots that are more than an inch from where I'm aiming, or more than a 1/2 inch from where I'm aiming, I'm going to say, something seems like the gun has changed. If the group is more than an inch, that should be, at least based on 190 shots, that should be a greater than 3 sigma, a 0.003% chance that I would print a group like that, right?
Okay.
And so for me, that's a signal where I'm like, maybe the rifle needs to be cleaned, or, I left something loose, or my scope is moving, the condition is changing, But again, if the wind changes, I would expect my cluster to move, right? Assuming the wind has changed uniformly. If it's doing this, then maybe you would expect to see a lot of horizontal, right? But the vertical in that case, may or may not be. You can still apply that 1, 2, 3 sigma filter to what you're seeing on target, and that's your signal. Like, hey, that was a 4 sigma shot I just threw, right?
Yeah.
Shouldn't be happening that often. So
exactly the point. And like you mentioned, wind. If you have a change in the wind, I see people do this all the time. They say, oh, did you see that gust? It blew me way out over into the 8-ring, and everybody else hit in the X-ring. Well, use all of the data that's available to you to see what the cause of your problem may be. Because a flinch, the bipod wasn't set right, you didn't have it in your shoulder right, that can create that shot that goes off to the side that you thought was a wind, but it was actually you. You need to do problem solving when you start to see those things. If I see one of my shots goes out into the 8-ring, there's a lot of different possibilities. Mental error. I aimed in the wrong spot. I thought I was aiming here, but I actually aimed over there. That happens. I've done that at a national championship. I did, in fact, yip the shot and send it over there. Or I look around and everybody seems to have landed in about the same spot. Oh, that was the wind. Right? Or one guy got it in, he saw it, but everybody else went wide. It's like, okay, that tells me something. And then if I do decide to fire another shot on the same point of aim and it lands on top of it, okay, that was likely conditions. It's less likely to be a transient situation like a bad shouldering of the rifle. Although you can shoulder the rifle wrong and just continue down that road for quite some time. I've done it, so it's possible. But you know, we've kind of come around to where we're looking at individual shots, and I talk about the one-shot group, and that's a misnomer. It's an intentional misnomer. So guys, if you're watching and you hear me say one-shot group, don't assume that I'm saying you can characterize a rifle with one shot. That's not true. The idea of a one-shot group is we're assessing each and every shot individually so that we can characterize the total performance of the rifle in less total shots, because if we're shooting 5-shot groups, we only get a characterization every 5 shots.
Yep.
But if we take and break that down into 5 individual shots, we get 5 individual characterizations.
You're getting 5 times the data, right?
Yeah.
1 number versus 5 numbers. And it's just, you're going to move down that curve faster. And actually, so I did all these same processing with the group sizes. I did my running average group size. Yes, it changes. Even after 15 groups, I'm off the correct answer. I did my mean error variation 1,000 times with 38 groups. And what's important to note about the group size on this chart is it's visually, you can see it as much more widely distributed about the mean. There's 0 error point. So the groups are subject to a lot more variation than the radius. And most importantly, it does not converge to the correct answer every single trial, right? Like the radius plot, next down always goes to the same average after 190 shots, because you're averaging the same set of data 1,000 times. Yeah. So you're guaranteed to get the right answer as if you average all the data available to you.
Yeah.
The groups, if you randomly resequence the shots and take 5-shot groups out of this new sequence, you will not necessarily get the right answer, even after 38 groups. Because there is a combination of shots where the extreme spread on every group is bigger than average.
Okay.
And the reason that's so important is that not only does it take more groups to get to the same level of confidence, which I'll show on this plot here. So it's the same one that we were looking at before, but if you switch back and forth, you can see that for the same number of shots, if you look at group versus shot, you get to the same level of confidence earlier using shot radius.
Okay.
But more importantly, even after the end, the average is wrong. Like, you're not guaranteed to have the right average, because when you measure a group, you are losing information on the internal shots, right?
Okay.
So when you reshuffle, now you get 2 shots that you never knew about before are now the ones you're reading information on, right? And you reshuffle again and 2 different shots might bound the group. So doing it with groups, you are not necessarily guaranteed to ever converge to the right answer, right? And again, I think it's because that azimuth variation is sort of random. And so throwing a shot up here and up here gives you the small group, and throwing a shot up here and then down here gives you a big group, but it's the same radius, it's the same amount of error dispersion, right? And measuring group size, you are not ever guaranteed to get the correct average, even after a lot of groups, just because you're losing so much information every time you do it.
And you're describing now realistically the difference between precision and accuracy, because precision is how closely together the shots land, and accuracy is how closely the shots land to the intended point of impact to a certain extent. So that's really the difference here, although that's not what we're talking about specifically. If you have a mean radius, and we're looking at a mean radius, it depends on where you're measuring from, right?
Yeah, so ideally, you center your sights perfectly and your rifle holds 0, and now your mean radius is exactly your distance from target, right?
Yeah.
And And by the way, a little quick aside, one beautiful advantage of logging every shot and calculating the relative center is it tells you exactly what you need to click your scope to zero your rifle. So if you do it over 25 shots and you have all this data and the relative center is minus 0.3 and plus 0.1, you know you need to come up a click and you're close enough on lateral, right? But it's a very high confidence way to center your group on the target and truly zero your rifle versus like looking at the size of the group, which again could be thrown off by one farther shot, right? And then trying to, visually eyeball it and center it. And again, some apps basically do this for you by logging the position of each shot and telling you the virtual center. But when you do it this way, if you could string all that together for 20 or 25 shots, you get a super reliable zero for your scope. So that's another benefit of this is, again, for a hunter, I care a lot about the cold bore shot.
Yeah.
And so, before I zero my rifle, I'll take 20 shots. And at the range, I don't care if it's down here. But then I take all that data and I'm like, okay, I can bring it right on center and have high confidence in it.
You talk about cold bore shots. Cold bore shots, we get two versions of this. We get cold bore and we get cold clean bore. So which one do you track for your stuff? Do you clean a rifle and then foul it?
Yes, yeah,
Okay.
totally.
And then you do cold bore from a fouled condition but cold, right?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's, and same with muzzle velocity. I mean, you can measure the first shot, after I clean my rifle, the first shot might be 100 feet per second slower.
Yeah,
and then it takes a couple to come in, and it comes in pretty quick, and you may or may not see a POI difference. Oftentimes you do.
I just did it yesterday with the dasher.
Yeah, and was it off
yeah.
the group center?
The first shot out of a cold clean bore hit low. Not a lot low, 3-4 inches low. The next 4 shots all went into a group.
Yep.
And it was right there, nice and tight like it should be. But yeah, you have to have that first shot through the barrel. And if you don't, you need to understand where that's going to go, how much it tends to be slow, and that's just a matter of experimenting with your rifle. When you clean it and you go out to shoot, keep track of where that first one hits and what the velocity was, because there might be that time when you go hunting and it's like, okay, I don't have a chance to foul this rifle. If I do, I'm going to scare all the game away, right?
Yeah.
So I'm going to go ahead and adjust my ballistic solutions for my expected velocity and my expected point of impact. And you can do that. It's, the ballistic apps can do that. And then you can have confidence that you can make that shot on an animal if the opportunity arises.
Yeah, in that case, I would say if you've done it 10 times from a clean bore and you've seen the same, again, it's this thing of like, can you characterize that well? Personally, when it comes to hunting season, I'm religious. I clean my gun and I load up 50 rounds and I go shoot, 5 or 10 with the chronometer on. I use a barrel mounted chronometer. So
Okay.
My groups are meaningless when I take velocity data, but I use the first 10 to foul the gun and watch my velocity come up and make sure that average compares well to my 30 shot running average for muzzle velocity. Once it's there, then I'll take the chronometer off and shoot 20 rounds for groups and not touch my scope and plot every shot and zero the gun. And then I don't touch that gun until the end of hunting season, or I use it during hunting season. But I use the same batch of ammo from a clean gun, 30 shots in, I'm thoroughly, fouled in, and I'm only worried about 1 or 2 shots over the next 3 months, so I don't need to worry about how many rounds am I going to put, am I going to have a fouling problem? No, I'm that way my zero is as fresh and as relevant as it can be. I can be sure my speeds are right, and that's how I approach it, because losing an animal is the worst feeling in the world. So I do everything I can to avoid that situation.
Yeah, and that's just good ethical hunting. And I wanted to point to that because you are a hunter as your primary shooting sport, so to speak, but this goes across all disciplines. I mean, this for an F-class person, if you're shooting F-class, you should be listening to this, because this is how you get to that point where you show up at the range and all you have to do is read the wind.
Yep.
And you don't have to worry about anything else. You just do your performance and the rifle does its part. This is how, if you are a PRS competitor, you show up at the range and you do your performance and the rifle does its part. and for many other sports. I'm not, like I said, I'm not going to speak to bench rest because they operate differently. But for a lot of sports, if you can do this for yourself and just characterize your barrel and then make small incremental changes to improve your statistical averages, maybe the first barrel you're going to put a lot of rounds through it doing testing. The next barrel reamed with the same reamer, same exact specifications, is likely to shoot almost identically. So you can shorten that process one barrel at a time. And when you look at how I do load development on a 284, that's because I have, oh, I'm embarrassed to say this, I probably have 14 barrels that are in process in my home.
What you have, Keith, is a problem. You have a problem.
I have a problem.
This is an intervention, actually.
They aren't shot out yet, but yeah, I know what the load is for all of them, and oddly enough, they all shoot the same load. So that's one of those things that you gather data by doing, and if you get a baseline of what works for your reamer, your cartridge, and you aren't changing cartridges with the wind like so many people unfortunately do, you're going to get that refined feel for what does shoot well, and you can take that to the bank, and then it'll propel you to the top in competitive shooting.
Yeah, you'd rather take the thing you can trust that's maybe lower performance than the advertised number that somebody else says, right? But if you trust your system and it's well characterized, that is just worth way more, in my opinion. It's worth a lot more. Because you now know what to expect, and it's not just based on gut. It's like, yeah, it's real, right? It's a real characterized physical system. And, in engineering, this is how we approach before someone goes and flies on something, right? It is thoroughly tested. Every subsystem is tested and accepted and has been shown to meet its requirements. There's no, I think it's going to work. Well, sometimes there is, but for the most part, everything that we're doing, because there's lives and millions of dollars on the line, you have to prove it first, right? And that's exactly the same philosophy that I'm applying here. It's like, so yesterday I went and shot at 600, hunting rifle, hunting load, fouled barrel, exactly what I just described for approaching the hunting season. And I hit 2 inches from center at 600 yards in conditions from shooting from my backpack prone. So for me, I was super happy, because that means that, all this 50 shots of characterization, lo and behold, it holds at 600 yards, just like the math says it should, right? And the SD of 9 and muzzle velocity characterized over 22 shots, which is what I'm at right now. Sure enough, the ballistic solution that you get from that is reliable. And if I had spent that 70 shots of characterization instead trying to tune in every time I went to the range changing something, I would have shown up with a load that I don't really know what to expect, right? So I could have hit 2 inches from center and gotten lucky, or I could hit 8 inches and I'd be like, I don't know, maybe my zero's wrong, maybe my velocity's higher than I thought, right? But no, when you keep everything consistent, consistency is key. It allows you to really know what to expect.
I think that's the key to any kind of shooting sport where you're trying to get precision and accuracy out of a rifle. The first thing you have to do is stop moving things. Let something be consistent. Have some constants, or as many constants in the system as you can. Change only one thing at a time.
Yes, that's very important.
And then don't change it unless you know what it is that needs to be changed.
Yeah, and I think it's important here, like, again, what prompted this is I really wanted to, find some bridge between the theories, the classical methods of load development, and sort of the, statistical futility that Brian presents in this book of doing any sort of development or tuning, right? I wanted to bridge that. And so, yeah, I think there is a time for testing and tuning. But again, you have to always keep in mind, how many samples? Is this a reliable data point? Is this a strong signal or a very small signal? And do I have enough samples to characterize a very small signal? So yes, you can test and tune. And I think there's a theoretical basis for that being a valid method, but you just have to interpret your data carefully. And then at a certain point, you need to start changing directions and putting more resources into characterization and increasing these statistical confidence levels and all this stuff. And that at a certain point, that is more valuable than chasing noise, chasing a tenth of an MOA group size or something.
And we hear a lot of anecdotal, evidence, so to speak. I don't like calling it evidence, but it's anecdotes about people did this and got this result and they won and whatever else happens. And my response to that typically is, well, a lot of people buy lottery tickets every single day and somebody wins. Are you looking at an anecdote of somebody that won the lottery, they got lucky on a change they made, or did they win despite the change they made? We don't know that. There's no way to articulate which one it was. So we have to be really careful about saying this technique worked for so-and-so this time, and therefore it is the rule of how to do things. So I think that's really the myth that we're trying to dispel here. But in summary, what I take away from our conversation is that the best way to characterize rifle performance as far as precision is concerned is on paper with mean radius.
Yep.
And then to characterize that mean radius over a large sample size so that we have enough data that we can rely upon it and the standard deviation starts to shrink so that we can understand what the data is telling us. And then the last part is be really consistent with what you're putting into the system so that you aren't making random changes that create random results on the output, because the variation input to output is not consistent. You can have the same input and get a slight randomization of the output in the form of noise. And if you start changing inputs and you have that noise, you can mischaracterize the noise as signal. Right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Pay attention to the magnitude of the signal you're getting versus the magnitude of the noise of the system. And at a certain point, you should pay attention to it. But you have to have some baseline so that you know when there's a real change happening, right? Yeah. Versus just scatter.
And that's really where the experience of F-class has led me, right? 10 years, I can lay down behind the rifle and shoot a relay and say, the rifle doesn't feel right. There's something not right here. I can't articulate it, but I'll lay down behind that same rifle with the same ammunition and shoot another relay with it during a national championship to try to articulate, is it something I'm doing or is it the rifle? Do I have something wrong with the front rest or is it the rifle? And if it is the rifle, when you take a spare rifle, a lot of times I'll pull the rifle ammunition and everything and say, I'm not shooting this anymore today, I'm going to shoot my other rifle. Mm-hmm. Because that other rifle, number one, it gives me confidence because I know that rifle shoots well. And then number two, it's a completely different system. And if I start to get the same signal from the second system, it was not the rifle to begin with.
Yeah,
I didn't change something on rifle one, on my A rifle, until I've checked with the B rifle to see if the B rifle actually shoots better than the A rifle does.
Yep. And that's it sounds like your gut, but I mean that's a rigorous method. You're doing an A/B test, right?
Yeah.
You're doing a control essentially on is it conditions or the gun, and that's a great approach to it.
Unfortunately, when you do that, you're doing it over time, and the conditions do change from relay to relay. So you are inducing a lot of noise into your own signal by doing that, but it's the only way in real time when you're on the line trying to shoot the rifle and win a match to separate the wheat from the chaff. But once again, having that rifle with intrinsic precision,
and a lot of samples backing it up,
and
right? Because you shot that, like you said, same
design.
barrel, same load,
Yep.
so you know what to expect, right?
Yeah.
And
so when it does go out and it gets as far out as it can get, it's still somewhat acceptable. It may not be shooting cleans, but it's going to be pretty close to it. And you say, okay, I'm starting to see that I'm getting this bigger pattern over 20 shots. I'm starting to see a 20-shot series that is looking big, and it's not tracking. The point of impact is randomly moving around, as opposed to it moves over here and puts 2 over here, then it puts 5 over there, and then it puts 3 over here, and that may be you. But if you have over here, over there, and every shot is in a different spot, now you're starting to sense the system is releasing the bullets at random places in the vibration of the barrel. And I believe that barrel vibration gives us most of our group size too. So now you can start to characterize that within even a small sample like 20 shots, but 5 shots, no way, you aren't going to do it.
Yep.
And 3 shots, definitely not. If you're shooting 3 shots and changing something, sitting there adjusting your seating depth on the line, well, you might get lucky, but it's random luck to find something better.
Yeah, and it would have to be a really big outlier signal to pay attention to it over the course of 3 shots, right? Like you'd have to be off the target before
8 ring to 8 ring.
Yeah,
routine,
exactly. Because again, you're comparing against mean and standard deviation. What do I expect? And if I have a good firm footing, I know that a 4 sigma answer is I should be raising my eyebrows. So yeah.
Yeah, especially when you start to see it over more shots.
Yeah,
I mean,
exactly.
you see 4 sigma, and then you start to see 4 sigma over 5 or 10 shots. Now you know you have a problem.
Yeah, exactly.
And in F class where we have unlimited sighters, that's an opportunity, right? You sit there and you start shooting, and you start to think, wow, that this rifle isn't doing what I expect. I've got ammunition. Let's shoot some more sighters and see if it's me, if it starts to tighten up, or if something else is going on here. And if it just stays big, the rules allow changing a rifle prior to the first record shot. So you can go get that B rifle out and shoot it instead. Shoot a bunch of sighters through it and decide if maybe that's a better situation for you, and then go for it. If the B rifle shoots just like the A rifle does, it's the conditions. You might as well shoot that rifle. It doesn't really matter.
Yeah.
So you have an opportunity, especially in F class, to get squared away and give yourself a chance. But if you're moving your variables while you're doing it, you have a real high risk of defeating yourself.
Yeah. Now again, maybe the other big topic in this book is barrel tuners and whether or not they have an effect. Now again, from the first principles of the barrel harmonic theory, I would think they do. I don't know if moving the weight a turn on a machine, tight machine thread, if that's significant enough to what you're trying to do is alter the frequency of the fundamental frequency of the barrel, right? And if you bring the weight out, that's going to reduce the frequency, and so you might get your first extreme, and then it starts to reverse. That might happen later, and so if you think your bullet is leaving too early during a scatter motion, while it's transitioning from one end of the oscillation to the other, maybe that works. But I don't know. I haven't run the math personally on if you move a 6-ounce tuner a thousandth of an inch, how much does that change the frequency, and is that significant with respect to the bullet time, right? I would think you could do that pretty easily. And then if you test that thoroughly and you can show I have 50 rounds that says at this bullet time, my group is this size. And then if I crank that tuner in and my group opens up and I crank it in again and it tightens up, and you characterize and you do 50 shots or 50 shots, whatever the number is, and you do statistical testing to show that those populations are different, maybe it is feasible to crank the tuner on the line, if you're observing the same behavior that you've thoroughly tested. But again, that's from the assumption that you are thoroughly testing and characterizing before you go and do that, right?
Yeah.
And certainly not on top of other things that are changing too, right?
Yeah, and the other thing is you talk about characterizing the behavior in a test environment, but when you go into a competition environment, you also have to characterize the behavior that you're seeing on the target in real time under the clock, and that's where the problem lies. Because you're going to shoot 3 or 5 shots, and does that really tell you enough about the characteristic of the tune to make a change? And the answer is not very likely.
Yeah, probably not. Unless it's a huge signal, probably not.
If you get a huge signal, it's shooting really big, of course. You can make that change. But if it's shooting a little bigger than what you like, or you're just trying to get a little bit out of it, it's shooting a 5-inch vertical and you want to make it a 3-inch vertical, that's going to be really hard at 1,000 yards with all the other noise that's in the system. Mirage, wind, it just goes on and on.
Yep.
So it's one of those real challenges in the shooting sports to tell people that yes, what you're using for a tuning facility, be it seating depth, powder charge, tuner, rubber bands on the barrel, whatever you're going to use, which I've done, by the way, it works. You have to be able to characterize what's going on before you make the change. and then be able to characterize the result of making the change in a way that you can feel confident that that change actually made a difference. And unfortunately, barrels only last so long, and that's really the balance point, right? A 22 rimfire barrel lasts virtually forever, but with a center fire rifle, you've got 2,000 rounds, maybe. Some of these bigger, higher powered stuff, 1,500. And trying to characterize over time with one barrel, it's not going to happen in the life of that barrel. So now you have to characterize the cartridge and the barrel design over, it just did it again. The cartridge and the barrel design over multiple barrels so that you can start to get a gut for that cartridge and how it performs and what it's going to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that is why a lot of the very experienced shooters can, with seemingly small samples, they can observe, a pattern on target and say something might be wrong, right? Mm-hmm. But yeah, again, there's a lot of data behind that. So yeah, you just have to be careful, because I think it's very easy to be misled. And if you're not, I will also say this, because my dad is more of an old school shooter, mm-hmm. and so he's not really measuring each group even, mm-hmm. and tracking that over time, right? He maybe will take the picture of the group or save the cutout in his data book, and so that's a pretty good group, right? And mm-hmm. I expect roughly that from my system, right? So I think it's important to actually apply data to these things and not just eyeball it, because your eye can be tricked by a lot of things, right?
Yeah.
And so if you are doing that and you can, again, over appropriate number of samples, test all these variations and you show the data. And like I said, I actually compare populations with statistical tests to see if they're the same or different and to what level of confidence. And I kind of let that guide my decision making as to whether or not I had made a change or really it's not a big change. If you're doing that, then I think this all holds true, but very few people are doing that. It's because it takes a lot of time, and in my case, I use some fancier computing. I don't think you need anything more than Excel really to do it, which most everyone has access to.
So. On a smaller signal scale, I just went out and did this yesterday with a dasher, with a PRS rifle. I was comparing my hand loads to the factory loads for dasher, the only factory load that I can find for the dasher. Shooting 5-shot groups at 600 yards. I shot 5-shot groups. If I were to look at those groups individually, one at a time, I could say, oh yeah, the factory is nothing compared to my hand loads. Or I could look at 2 other groups and say, wait a minute, the opposite is true. But when I start averaging the data, now I start to see that they are close enough that I don't have a statistically significant difference between them. Mm-hmm. in the performance of the 2 loads. So does that mean that the factory ammo is equivalent to mine? No, not necessarily. It means I can't prove that there's a difference, but what I can prove is they both meet my requirements for my competition shooting, so I don't have to mess with it. Mm-hmm. That one just died.
Yeah, and I think that's a valuable outcome, right? And I would say, use the radius and do a t-test and really, then you have a level of confidence. Sometimes, like for instance, part of what I was testing with these 200 rounds was I thought, you know what, I'll be fancy and I'll get these little dots mm-hmm. and graph paper and, aim small, miss small, right? Well, the little dots are actually hard to hold, to center your crosshairs because you don't have much reference. And when you put a shot on a dot or a group on a dot, your center hold goes away. Exactly. And so I was noticing, like, man, my groups are kind of bigger when I shoot on these dots versus these.
Yep.
So I plotted the radius of all of them and did a t-test. And again, I don't know if that's the right test, but I did it. Mm-hmm. And showed that, to a confidence level of 99%, I shoot tighter radii on these spots than on these spots. And so it's same idea, right? You're changing a variable, but then you're rigorously interpreting the results. Yeah. And again, I like radius. I think it's a better way to do that. But even group size is, whatever you're doing, if you can apply numbers and data to it and proper methods, you know what, now I only shoot with these, right? Because I've proven to myself I shoot better on these. So
Yeah,
yeah.
that makes sense. And I actually use that same target in a 6-inch format at 600 yards to test the dasher with,
Yeah.
because I can see that black diamond very clearly, and I can center up on it really nicely with the reticle that I have.
Yeah.
Well, I think we have probably run out of cameras here because they're getting to shutting down one at a time.
Okay.
So we'll call it good at this one. We'll have to get back together later because there's a lot more to talk about. There's a huge body of knowledge here, and your contribution to that body of knowledge is something that I think that people need to pay attention to, because it does fit in the overall concept of what we're trying to accomplish when we're tuning rifles, when we're trying to make precise rifles, when we're trying to create a situation where we can put the bullet where we want it from any given distance.
Mm-hmm.
So I appreciate it. Thank you so much for talking to me today, and
I really appreciate the
taking time
opportunity.
out of your Father's Day. And I'm gonna get out of here and go see if I can find where my family went today.
All right. Thank you, man.
Yeah, thank you.